The house had felt different ever since Jake broke up with Lisa. It was as if a shadow had fallen over our home, casting a pall over what had once been a space filled with light and laughter. The breakup wasn't sudden. I had seen the signs of their relationship deteriorating over the months. Fewer visits, less laughter, and a heaviness in Jake's eyes that he couldn't quite hide. But even though I could sense it coming, I don't think either of us was truly prepared for how it would affect him. Jake had always been a sensitive soul. Even as a child he felt everything so deeply. I used to joke that he carried his heart not on his sleeve, but in his hands, wide open for anyone to see. So when he came home that night, his face pale and his eyes rimmed with red, I knew immediately what had happened. He didn't say much at first. He simply sank into the couch, his body folding in on itself as if trying to make himself smaller, less visible. I sat down next to him, feeling the ache in my own chest, a mirror of the pain he was feeling. I wanted to reach out, to wrap my arms around him like I did when he was a little boy and a scraped knee seemed like the end of the world. But I knew better. I had learned that when it came to his heart, I needed to let him come to me. "It's over," he finally whispered, staring blankly at the television screen, though I knew he wasn't really watching it. "I'm so sorry, Jake," I said softly. He gave a curt nod, a single tear slipping down his cheek before he hastily wiped it away. It was hard to see him like this, so broken. I longed to take his pain away, but I also knew he needed to feel it, to let it wash over him before he could begin to heal. The days that followed were quiet. Jake moved around the house like a ghost, his presence heavy and muted. He spent most of his time in his room, the door half closed, a barrier that I respected but hated. The house felt emptier, despite him being home more often. It was as if the life had been drained from it, leaving behind only the hushed sounds of his quiet grief. One evening, about a week after the breakup, I found him in the kitchen. He was sitting at the counter, a half-eaten sandwich in front of him, staring into space. I decided to join him, hoping that maybe tonight he would open up, even just a little. "Hey," I said gently, pouring myself a cup of tea and sitting down across from him. "Do you want to talk about it?" He looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw the flash of a little boy who used to come to me with every scrape and bruise, trusting me to make it better. But he was a man now, and this wasn't a hurt that a Band-Aid could fix. "There's not much to say," he replied, his voice flat. "It just didn't work out." "I'm sorry," I said again, knowing it wasn't enough but saying it anyway. "You really loved her." He nodded, swallowing hard, and I could see he was fighting to keep his composure. "Yeah," he admitted. "I thought we were going to get married, you know? We talked about it." My heart clenched at his admission. I hadn't realized just how serious things had been between them. "I know you did," I said softly, reaching out to cover his hand with mine. He didn't pull away, but he didn't squeeze back either. He just sat there, staring at our joined hands, as if the sight of them was too much to bear. Over the next few weeks, he began to spend more time with me, and less time out with friends or at work. It was almost as if he was seeking out my company, looking for a place where he could feel safe and understood. I didn't mind. In fact, I relished it. It had been a long time since he and I had spent this much time together, and I found myself enjoying his presence despite the circumstances that brought him back home. One Saturday morning, I decided to take him out for a walk in the park. The sun was shining, the sky a bright, cloudless blue, the kind of day that always lifted my spirits, and I hoped it might do the same for him. He seemed reluctant at first, but after some gentle prodding, he agreed. We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the distant laughter of children playing. I kept stealing glances at him, taking in the lines of stress on his young face, the sadness that still lingered in his eyes. He looked so much older than his 25 years, and it broke my heart. "I don't know what to do with myself now," he said suddenly, startling me out of my thoughts. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I had my whole future planned out with her," he admitted, his voice raw. "Now I feel lost. Like I don't even know who I am anymore without her." I stopped walking and turned to face him, placing a hand on his arm. "Jake, you're going to be okay," I said firmly. "You're still you. And maybe this is a chance for you to figure out who you are outside of a relationship. It's going to hurt for a while, but it won't hurt forever." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something. Reassurance, hope, maybe just a sign that things would get better. "What if I don't get over her?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "You will," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "And until you do, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He pulled me into a hug then, a hug so tight it nearly took my breath away. I could feel his tears on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arms around him, holding him as if I could shield him from the world, from his own pain. For a moment we stood there, two people clinging to each other in a sea of shared sorrow and love. As the weeks turned into months, the heaviness in the house began to lift, little by little. Jake started going out with friends again, started smiling more. But he still spent a lot of time with me, and our walks became a ritual. We talked about everything and nothing. His dreams, his fears, his favorite movies from when he was a kid. It felt like I was getting to know him all over again, not as the little boy I'd raised, but as the man he was becoming. And slowly I realized something. This time we were spending together wasn't just healing him. It was healing me too. When my son Jack started to show his attentiveness, it wasn't surprising at first. He had always been a caring child, the kind who would bring me flowers he picked from the garden or ask how my day was going when he came home from school. But as he grew older, the way he cared for me changed. It became more intense. I had been struggling with the house upkeep after his father left. The loneliness was consuming, and it felt like a piece of my world had shattered. Jack, sensing this, stepped in seamlessly. At 22, he was no longer a boy but a young man, strong and confident, but with a gentleness that never left him. He took it upon himself to help with everything, from fixing the leaky faucets to cooking dinner when I was too tired. It felt comforting having him around, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. One evening we were sitting on the couch, the soft glow of the TV illuminating the room. We weren't watching the movie, not really. We were talking about his plans, his hopes for the future. And then the conversation took a turn I hadn't expected. "You know, Mom," Jack said, his voice unusually soft, "I feel like you and I understand each other better than anyone else." I smiled, touched by his words. "We've always had a special bond, haven't we?" His eyes lingered on mine, and for a moment I felt a strange flutter in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. It was a fleeting moment, and I quickly brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing more than a mother's affection for her child. But as the weeks went on, those moments became more frequent. He would sit closer, his hand finding mine during quiet moments, lingering longer than necessary. One night after dinner, I was washing the dishes when Jack came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. It was an innocent enough gesture, something he used to do when he was younger, but this time it felt different. His hold was firmer, more deliberate. I could feel his breath against the back of my neck, warm and unsteady. "Jack," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice even. "What are you doing?" He didn't pull away. Instead, he tightened his grip slightly, resting his chin on my shoulder. "I'm just hugging you, Mom. Is that so wrong?" There was something in his voice, a hint of vulnerability that I hadn't heard before. It made my heart ache, but not in the way it should have. I gently extricated myself from his hold, turning to face him with a forced smile. "Of course not, sweetheart," I said, ruffling his hair like I used to when he was little. "But you're a grown man now. You don't need to be clinging to your mom." He gave me a small, sad smile, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe I do," he whispered before walking away, leaving me standing there, breathless and confused. From that moment on, I started noticing everything. The way his gaze lingered a little too long, the way he would brush his hand against mine whenever we passed each other in the hallway. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He wasn't just being affectionate, there was something deeper, something I was afraid to acknowledge. One rainy afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring out the window as the raindrops slid down the glass. Jack walked in, sitting beside me so close that our legs were touching. He didn't say anything for a while, just sat there watching the rain with me. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said finally. "Yes," I agreed, my voice barely a whisper. He reached for my hand, holding it gently. I didn't pull away this time. Instead, I let him hold it, feeling the warmth of his skin seep into mine. It felt wrong, but it also felt comforting. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "I need to tell you something." I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The look in his eyes was intense, filled with an emotion I couldn't name but recognized all too well. I had seen that look before, but never directed at me. "Jack, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't." He held my hand tighter. "I can't help it. I've tried, but I can't." The raw honesty in his voice left me breathless. This was my son, the boy I had raised, the one I had comforted through scraped knees and heartbreaks. But the man sitting in front of me now was different. There was a need in his eyes, a yearning that frightened me. "We can't do this," I said, pulling my hand away, my voice firm despite the tears welling up in my eyes. "This isn't right, Jack." He looked devastated, like a lost child. "But you're everything to me," he said, his voice breaking. "You're my soulmate." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Soulmate. It wasn't a word a son used for his mother, but there it was, hanging between us like a forbidden promise. I stood up, putting as much distance between us as I could. "You don't mean that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're confused, that's all. You've been taking care of me for too long, and it's clouded your judgment." He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "Oh, Mom, I know what I feel. And I think you do too." My breath hitched, and for a moment I let myself feel it. The connection, the pull between us that I had been denying for so long. But it was only a moment. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let us cross a line that could never be uncrossed. "I'm your mother," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I love you, but not like that. I can't." He looked at me, the pain in his eyes cutting deeper than any words could. "I know," he said softly, "but I don't think I can stop feeling this way." He turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the living room. The rain continued to fall outside, each drop echoing the silent tears I couldn't hold back any longer. The moonlight streamed through the thin curtains of my bedroom, casting pale silver patterns across the floor. I had been lying there for hours, staring up at the ceiling, unable to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in my head. Jack had become more distant recently, his usual playful nature replaced by a quiet sadness that hung around him like a heavy fog. I could feel it, even if he didn't say a word. And it broke my heart knowing that I was the cause. I turned on my side, hugging the pillow close, trying to push away the ache in my chest. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling in the cool night air. I thought everyone was asleep, and yet there was a part of me that couldn't find rest. I kept replaying his words in my head. Asterisk, you're my soulmate, asterisk. Wondering how we had reached this point, how I had allowed things to go this far. The emotions were raw, tangled, and impossible to ignore. And though I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that the fragile line we had been balancing on was about to snap. Then I heard it, the soft creak of the door opening. I held my breath, my body tensing as the door slowly swung open. Jack stepped inside, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. He looked at me, his eyes shining in the darkness, full of a sadness that made my heart ache. "Jack," I whispered, my voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the door behind him quietly, as if afraid of waking the world beyond this room. He stood there for a moment, hesitating, and I could see the conflict written across his face. It was the same look he had given me so many times recently, the one filled with unspoken words and forbidden feelings. "I couldn't sleep," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept thinking about you, about us." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him to go back to his room, to pretend this wasn't happening. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just watched as he crossed the room, his footsteps silent on the carpet. He came to the edge of the bed, looking down at me with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. "Jack, you shouldn't be here," I managed to say, but my voice lacked conviction. He shook his head, and before I could say anything more, he slid into the bed beside me. The mattress dipped under his weight, and I felt the warmth of his body press against mine. It was such a familiar comfort, yet tonight it felt charged with something dangerous, something we had both been trying so hard to deny. "Please," he said softly, his voice pleading, "just let me stay here for a while. I don't want to be alone tonight." My heart squeezed painfully in my chest. I knew what this meant, what we were teetering on the edge of. I could feel the tension crackling in the air between us, thicker than it had ever been. But I couldn't bring myself to push him away. Instead, I found myself turning to face him, our eyes locking in the dim light. He reached up, his hand trembling as he cupped my cheek. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, as though he were afraid I might disappear if he held on too tightly. I leaned into his hand despite myself, feeling the warmth of his palm against my skin, and I closed my eyes, letting out a shuddering breath. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending that I don't love you like this." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and inevitable. I opened my eyes, seeing the raw pain and longing in his gaze, and I knew I couldn't lie to him any longer. I couldn't lie to myself. "I know," I whispered back, my voice trembling. "I felt it too. But we can't, Jack. This isn't right." He moved closer, his forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel the tension radiating off him, the restraint he was barely holding on to. "I've tried to stay away," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've tried to make these feelings go away, but I can't. Love you. Need you. Not as my mother, but as something more." Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. I knew this was wrong. Every instinct told me to push him away, to end this before it went any further. But I couldn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into him, craving his warmth, his touch, the comfort I had been so starved of for years. "Jack," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. "If we do this, we can never go back." He pulled back slightly, looking into my eyes with a mixture of fear and hope. "I don't want to go back," he said. "I don't care about anything else. I just want you." Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in the softest of kisses. It was tentative, as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I couldn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. The kiss deepened, turning desperate, years of unspoken longing spilling out in that moment. His hands roamed my back, pulling me flush against him, and I could feel his heartbeat racing in time with mine. It was like nothing I had ever felt before, intense, consuming, and so very wrong. But it also felt like the most natural thing in the world. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads pressed together as we tried to catch our breath. I could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty, but also the fierce determination. "We can't keep this hidden," he said quietly. "We can't keep pretending that this isn't real." I nodded, tears spilling down my cheeks. "I know," I whispered. "But I'm scared, Jack. I don't know what this means or how we go on from here." He wiped away my tears with his thumb, his touch impossibly tender. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "Together." And in that moment I believed him. Because despite the fear, despite the guilt, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. I loved him too. More than I should, more than was right. But it was real and it was ours. We lay there in the darkness, holding each other as the moonlight bathed us in its soft glow. It felt like the world had disappeared, leaving just the two of us tangled together in a love that was as beautiful as it was forbidden. We had crossed a line we could never uncross. But for the first time in a long time I felt at peace.